One of the ways we bait the hook is actually with the name of your church. The former CEO of Quaker Oats once said, "If a business were split up, I would take the brands, the trademarks, and the goodwill, and you could have the bricks and mortar, and I would do better than you." So even if you had all the factories, all the hard assets, it's the brand, it's the name that he thought was considerably more valuable. What you need to ask as a church is, does your name communicate who you really are? Does it communicate you are to the community? Does your name communicate who you're for? Is this a church for Christians? Is it a church for non-Christians, for seniors? Who is this church for? And does your name communicate what to expect? What's it going to be like when you go to that church? Your name, you need to ask, is it attractive to your target? So are you baiting the hook for the fish you want to catch? So we're going to play a game, and it's a church name game, where I'm going to give you a name of a church. Now, most of these churches are fictitious churches, but what can you tell just from the name? So first one, Tabor Pentecostal Tabernacle. What year was this church founded? Well, if you guessed the 1940s or earlier, you're probably right. That was very common in those days. Is the naming convention was the location, the brand, and then something Old Testament-y, tabernacle or temple. Give away that it's a very old church. How old are the people at this church? How would you say that they dress here? What kind of music do they play? How many young families do you think they have? How effective do you think they are at evangelism? All right. How about 10th Avenue Pentecostal Assembly? When was this church planted? And if you guessed the 60s or 70s, you'd probably be right. Pentecostal Assembly, really, really popular there. People moved away from Tabernacle. Not enough people knew what that was. But it's still where it is, the brand, and assembly. A church that was planted in the 60s, 70s, how old would the people be here? What do you think the building would look like? What kind of music do you think they sing here? It's amazing how much information you think you can get just from a name. How about St. Augustine's? What denomination do you think this is? What do you think their building looks like? What kind of clothes would the pastor wear? What do you think the windows in the sanctuary look like? First Baptist Church. Now, there are thousands of First Baptist churches. What do you think the building looks like? How do you think people dress at First Baptist Church? How full is the auditorium at First Baptist Church? What kind of music do you think they play? First Fundamentalist KGV only Baptist Church. Who are these people targeting? What do you think their attitude is to other evangelical churches in town? What kind of music do you think they play? How many people attend this church? Christian Life Assembly, also a common name. When was this church started? And if you're guessing probably the 80s, you might be very right. How probable would you think that they still use flags at this church? What do you think the music is like? How would you say people dress here? Berean Bible Church. Who are these guys trying to attract? What is their most important emphasis in this church? What do you think the preaching is like? How do you think the pastor dresses? Word of Faith Church. What do you think their theological emphasis is at this church? How old do you expect most of the people are here? What is the probability you're going to see flags in this church? Living Waters Community Church. When was this church started? If you're guessing the 1980s, you're probably very right. This was all the rage in the 80s, where people were realizing that most people no longer understood or identified with the traditional brands. People didn't know what a Presbyterian was. They didn't know what a Methodist was. They didn't know what a Pentecostal was. And so they cast the net more broadly by calling them community churches. Now, it still might have some kind of denominational tie, very likely still part of a denomination, but that's not what they were advertising. And Living Waters, well, now they're trying to have a name that doesn't just tell you where they are, but kind of what it's like. But this says the 1980s. What do you think the probability is that they have a plexiglass pulpit with a lot of floral arrangements in the front? What color do you think their pews are? And if you're guessing dusty rose, you're probably right. Taylor Memorial Pentecostal Church. What's important to these people? How do you think they dress? How many people do you think come to Christ on a regular basis here? How many young people go to this church? The Journey. What year was this church planted? And if you guessed early 2000s, you're right. Nothing says emerging church as a church name that doesn't give you any kind of a hint that it's a church. The Journey, The Gathering, all those kinds of names, early 2000s. What you're expecting in a church here is they probably have PowerPoint, they probably have electric guitars, they probably have stained glass windows and candles, and it's a fusion of them all. Nothing says Gen X like a name like this. God of All Glory Revival Pentecostal Church. What kind of church is this? Now this is probably a coin flip. It's 50-50 that this is either an African church or a Filipino church. For reasons I don't quite understand, they love long names. D3. What do you think this name communicates to outsiders? When do you think this church was started? Now, if you're also saying early 2000s, you're probably right, but not by Gen Xers, much more likely by baby boomers. Koinonia Fellowship. Who are they trying to attract with their name? Are they fishing for people who are already Christians, or are they fishing for the unsaved? How many people have a basic understanding of ancient Greek that you'd want to put it in your name? Imago Dei. Well, the name of that church is Latin. It means the image of God. When was it planted? And if you're guessing the early 2000s, you're right. Again, you want to mix that ancient future. That's Gen X. That's emerging church. Altitude Church. When would this be planted? What is the average age of the people here? What is the probability that they have smoke and lights? Probably pretty high, because that is very typical of a name of a church planted within the last 10 years. Probably very, very young, probably very, very evangelistically passionate. It's amazing what you can get just from the name of a church. Now, if you're either planting a church or rebranding a church so that the name reflects who you are, there's a number of good best practices when you're choosing a name for your church. So first, you must be thinking that the name should communicate culture. In days gone by, when everybody went to church, the name communicated location. That's not true anymore. Others, the name needed to communicate brand. Nobody you're targeting understands your brand. Pentecostal, Presbyterian, Methodist, they don't know what those words mean. Now, the most successful churches shape their name so it communicates culture. What is the vibe? What is the feel? What is sort of the energy of this church? Your name should not sound like a funeral home. That's a mistake a lot of churches made, and it goes back to like 1980s kind of churches. But if your name of your church is Sleepy Meadows, Verdant Fields, Running Waters, anything that sounds like a retirement home or a funeral home, it's probably not communicating the culture that you really want it to. What it should is at least the first word of your name sound a little bit more like some kind of sporting goods kind of thing. So when you think of sort of the most successful churches that are most successful at reaching the unchurched, you're dealing with churches like Elevation Church. You're dealing with churches like Life Church, Discovery Church, Experience Church, I've been to Action Church, all those kinds of names that, you know what, if it wasn't associated with the church, I would think this is sporting goods. And for the same reason, they're trying to communicate a cultural vibe, that this is a place where something happens, something exciting happens, something important happens, you want to check it out. It should contain the word church. So a big mistake that the emerging church made in the early 2000s is getting rid of the word church. That was an error, very common error, but people need to know that it's a church. People don't know what a tabernacle is, or an assembly, or a center, or, those vague kind of terms, they're just confusing. Call it what it is, a church. That's best practices. You should resist the temptation to turn the name into an acronym. Now, there's two cardinal sins of vocabulary error in the church. One is overly religious terminology. When we use insider-owned language, we communicate to people subtly but very powerfully, you're not really one of us, and you don't really belong here. We want to avoid insider language as much as possible. So After a worship set, you do not want to come on stage and say, oh, wow, wasn't that just anointed worship? They don't know what that means. And even if they Google the word anointed, the dictionary definition is to ceremonially pour oil upon something. Well, what do we mean when we said that was anointed worship? We just meant that God used it in a special way. Why don't we just say that? Didn't God just use that in a special way? So insider-only religious language, bad, 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 bad. But almost as bad, and it's still insider-focused, is acronyms. Acronyms are always insider-focused and outsider-hostile. And they always communicate, you're not one of us, you're not in the in crowd, this isn't for you. Acronyms, fight them, fight them, fight them in everything you do. They communicate the exact opposite of what you intend. It's only for the cool insiders who know the code. Now, to do that in your name, the best way to fight acronyms is to have a church name that's only 2 words. Once you add a 3rd word, and there's just something about humans, we like creating acronyms because we like being in insider-only circles. Once there's 3 words, it's going to turn into an acronym. So fight that. Have a 2-word name. First word, something that communicates culture. Second word, church. That's the best practices in creating a name that's actually going to be effective at reaching the people that you want to reach.